On now to contract verbs. That is, there are certain verb stems that end in vowels that will contract with the connecting vowel. And there are patterns that we need to recognize so that we can figure out what the lexical form of the word is when we see it already contracted in the Greek text. Pray with me as we begin. Lord, help students as they progress now from thinking about the basics of verbs and the present active indicative there in chapter 16, and now here contract verbs. Give them confidence. The days will be difficult now and they need your grace. I know you'll supply it. I ask in Christ's name. Amen. Let's review verbs here for just a moment as we have noted along the way. Page 450 is just so helpful. In fact, why don't you just grab your textbook and open to page 457 here. You'll have an opportunity to see the screencast, and I'll work through Lego again in a moment. But just to remind you, the verbal root is the base of verbs, not the present. It's easy for students to think, oh, we're starting with the present. This must be the basis of all Greek verbs, because that's where we're at in chapter 16, chapter 17 now with the contract. We're still dealing with the present. But no, that is not the case. The present is not the base of Greek verbs. The verbal root is, and that verbal root is often extended the most when we get to the present. The aorist is often the most similar to its root. This won't seem like a problem now, but when we get to chapter 22, if you're not aware of this, there are going to be some difficulties. In fact, even in chapter 19, we will need to think about the way that verbal roots are taken up to form particular stems of verbs. To just review again, we have our ground level, and beneath the ground a root. We have our tree here, and then we have branches off of that tree here in all directions. And these 6 different designations, these 6 different stem bases, if you will, these are represented by the columns on pages 450 and following. That first column is the present. The second column, the future active and middle. The third column, the aorist active and middle. Fourth column, perfect active and middle. Fifth column, perfect middle and passive. And then the last column, the 6th column, is the aorist and future passive. Keep that in mind as we progress. And if you look there, page 457, you look at Lego, we have 3 different roots. Leg, air, and ip. 3 different roots for this one word. Now, when we think about the present, that's where we're at right now, it's formed off of Lego. So when we get to the present tense, we see Lego in the Greek text. But that is the only one of those 6 columns that uses leg. That second column over, the future active indicative, uses air. Right here. So here we go to the future, and that is the same for the perfect active and perfect middle passive. Ip is used just by the aorist active and middle there, that third column. So continue to look at verbs in your vocab section at the end of each chapter, and Mounts will note this designation and the difference between the root and the various stems that we have here. But feel free to come back to page 450. Just encourage you so much to go back and look at these patterns and see this very helpful appendix. Components of verbs then, again, just to review, it's the root that's the base, that's taken up into a particular stem. Those stems will sometimes end in a vowel that contracts. Now, upsilon's a vowel, but it doesn't contract. There are some that contract, those that end in alpha, epsilon, and omega. When those vowels get together with a connecting vowel like omicron or epsilon, there's a contraction involved, and that's the stuff of contract verbs, and that's what we're looking at now. Then we add the personal endings. We need to remember that personal endings don't change. There's no contraction with those in relation to these various combinations of stems and connecting vowels that we'll look at. So these personal endings are stable, and again, memorize those as we progress. Components of the verb, again, we have a stem, the connecting vowel, and it's here that we have this contraction. The personal endings are stable, so in some ways they're kind of off the table, as I note here. So we have the stem. There are vowels that contract, alpha, epsilon, omicron. When those come into contact with an omicron or epsilon connecting vowel, that's where we have a contraction right in here. And there are several patterns, as you have noted already in chapter 17 in Mounts, and I'm going to follow those patterns, those rules with you here on the next several slides. So the first pattern that we have forms omicron upsilon. What I have here in this table, these four basic columns, here's just the contraction that we're looking at. Then we have the inflected form. This is what you'll see in a text. So this column is what you're going to see in a text, and that will continue all the way down for the next few slides. And then you could sort of put a hard mark right here between this first column and the second column here. Here we, in these following columns, think about how we get to the inflected form. So here's what you're going to see in a text. How do we get there? Well, we've already assumed a root. We can just think about, again, a root down below here. We've assumed that, so now we're just working with the particular stem that's taken up, and we have here a stem that ends in epsilon, omicron, omicron. When these vowels come into contact with a connecting vowel, there is a contraction, and that's what we're looking at here. And as Mounts notes, it's so helpful for us in Greek that very often there's a circumflex. Not always, but very high percentage of the time. 80–90% of the time there's going to be a circumflex, like we see here, 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 over that contraction. So here is our first contraction pattern. Ooh, how do we get there? We have an epsilon, omicron or omicron coming into contact with an omicron or epsilon. And here are the patterns. If we have an epsilon omicron, we get oo. Reverse, we still get oo. Or omicron omicron, we get oo. Now here's why all of this is important. And the next few slides will go through a bit more quickly, but I want to just set the pattern and help you have a framework for what we're going to be learning here. This is why all of this is important for us, because in a text we will see this vowel combination and a circumflex over it, and we need to get to the lexical form. And by just looking at poiumen, plerute, plerumen, we don't know what the lexical form is. So we have to do some investigative work, lift up the hood, and find out how we get here. Well, how do we get to this particular combination? Well, it could be an epsilon stem ending, or an omicron stem ending, or an omicron stem ending, and then we would look at the connecting vowel. This takes us back to plera, and poia. This is what we need to find out. This is our goal, because if we can get to the stem, we can get to the lexical form, because the stem is going to be based on that lexical form, which is the present active indicative first person singular. Here we have the epsilon iota pattern. How do we get there? If you have an epsilon iota, behind it, underneath it, if you will, is epsilon epsilon. There's our connecting vowel. Here's our stem ending, epsilon. If you have this epsilon plus this epsilon, which is what we're looking at here, you get poie. And it's this that we have here. The circumflex over it helps us to cue that there is, in fact, a contraction going on. So epsilon, epsilon gets to epsilon iota and poieta. The third pattern we're looking at here is omega. This leads us to think about one of the principles of contractions and vowel patterns. Omega here is strong. Epsilon, on the other hand, is weak. Epsilon will drop out, and we will see that again and again. And this epsilon is weak, can drop out. Omega is strong and can swallow up a verb, or rather not a whole verb, but a letter. Let's think about agapa for a moment. And here, the alpha plus omicron equals omega, agapa. And if there is no ending with the first singular, for instance, of agapao, that alpha is actually consumed by the omega. It eats it up because that connecting vowel omicron lengthens to omega, and it eats up this alpha. So when we get into the first person singular, this strong omega here has eaten up this alpha, and we have agapo just in the actual text itself. When we think about the alpha contraction, the next pattern down, we are almost to the end now. We've covered the first, second, third, and now the fourth and fifth of these big rules that we're looking at here in chapter 17. Again, we have the alpha, and when that alpha comes into contact with an epsilon, we notice this principle that I mentioned a moment ago. Epsilon is weak, and that epsilon is going to just drop right out. You see it there? It just disappears because the alpha is stronger than the epsilon. And here, this iota is the third singular ending in the present active, and its subscripts right there. That's how we get agapa. If we were going to parse agapa, it's a third singular present active indicative from agapao. Again, agapao is a verb that's lexical form, has that alpha, but when we get to the actual text, the omega, here we're thinking again about the strong omega, eats that up. And you'll want to keep in mind the strength of the omega and the relative weakness of the epsilon. It drops out, and the omega, you can think of it turning on its side and begins to be like a crab eating up other vowels. On now to the final pattern. We have looked at u, a, o, a, and now eta, the a. Again, these are pronounced, this epsilon iota and the eta are pronounced similarly. But what we're doing, again, just to review, as I noted on the first slide, the inflected form is what we're going to see in a text. So we'll see something like plerute, poiete, agapomen. And we need to know what the lexical form is so that we can understand what meaning is. To get to the lexical form, we need to get to the stem. So in some ways, it's good to think about a hard line here between this second column over and the rest of these columns. These columns in our chart show us how we get here. So when we think about poi A, we have what vowel is the stem contract vowel? Epsilon, right there. And here we're dealing with the middle passive, and we're a bit ahead of ourselves. We'll get to the middle passives in the next chapter. But here this middle passive contraction happens because there's actually a sigma between the epsilon and the eta here, and that sigma has already dropped off. That's where we get this alpha, because there is no alpha connecting vowel. Remember, the connecting vowels are either omicron or epsilon. Alpha is not a connecting vowel, but there is a situation where the alpha and the epsilon come into contact if that sigma drops off, because the second singular middle passive ending for primary endings is psi, sigma alpha iota, and that sigma drops off. The iota here is at the end, and we have this epsilon alpha combination, and as we have seen, epsilon is weak. This alpha influences that epsilon to become eta, and that's what we have here, and the iota subscripts right there. So these basic 5 rules, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, will help us to understand the general patterns of contracts. Again, page 418 in Mounds provides a chart where you can look at all of these together and see how they work. Our master personal ending chart, we think about the endings that are here, and I again want you to memorize these endings. We have omitted the connecting vowel. I want you just to think about these endings, cementi-insi, and remember that nu drops off, lengthening of the omicron to upsilon, or omicron upsilon together, and usi. And this is the process that we go through. The vocab, finally, we look at the vocab and notice again that we have the asterisk by the root, not the stem as with nouns, but here by the root. And that root then is taken up into a particular stem, and you can see the consistency here with zeteo and agapao with the present. Again, keep looking at bridge options, and however you can be creative, it will be helpful. If you like the gap store, I love it. You hit a baseball in the gap. I love to hit a baseball in the gap. It's a base hit. Daimonion sounds like demon easily enough. Zeteo, zeal, you seek after something. Continue to work on vocab, and again, I want to emphasize looking at pages 450 and following as well with your verbs, and you can see the full pattern there.